Welcome. I'm Michael Manthorpe. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra, or indeed the traditional owners of any of the lands upon which you, our viewers, are watching today. Depending on the organisation you work for, I am either the ACT, Commonwealth, overseas students, vet student loans, private health insurance, or postal ombudsman to you. This year's Complaint Handling Forum is a first for two reasons. It'll be delivered entirely online, and it's the first time we've combined stakeholders from my office's Commonwealth and industry jurisdictions. The theme for this year's Complaints Handling Forum is Harnessing the Value of Complaints. The forum consists of 4 webinars over the next 2 weeks, with participants from across the country able to engage on harnessing the value of complaints. I trust this will be an engaging and relevant experience for you that offers a mix of strategic insights and useful complaint handling strategies. We have 2 keynote presentations, one from the Telecommunications Ombudsman Judy Jones and the General Manager for Customer Services at Australia Post, Teresa Forthrop. The forum also includes a practical workshop on managing unreasonable persistence presented by one of my directors, Tim O'Mahony. Finally, I'm facilitating a panel discussion with complaints handling experts from the private and public sector on managing complaints in the new normal, challenges faced and lessons learned. I'd like to introduce one of my directors, Tim O'Mahony, who has been working at the Office of the Commonwealth Ombudsman for 4 years. Tim currently leads the team responsible for education and training provided to government agencies on complaint handling, and previously he led frontline complaints teams at the office in parliamentary and industry jurisdictions. Prior to working at the office, Tim worked in regulatory and complaints handling roles in aged care and healthcare and education and training roles in Australia, China and the Philippines. Tim is committed to improving complaints handling across Australian and ACT government agencies and industry organisations through sharing examples of best practice and working collaboratively. Today, Tim will provide practical strategies to improve complaint handling capacity in dealing with unreasonably persistent conduct, followed by a question and answer session. I'm sure you will all join me virtually in welcoming Tim.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim O'Mahony. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. This is the second session of this year's Complaints Handling Forum, a workshop on managing unreasonable persistence. I hope everyone who came to Tuesday's session with the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman Judy Jones enjoyed it. I sure did. We have 2 sessions next week, which I'll talk about at the end of today's workshop. This session is on managing unreasonable persistence, and this theme came about through the work that my team does. We provide education and training to government agencies, and this is a topic that's come up quite frequently in our conversations, particularly around the time of COVID. The pandemic has seen an increase in unreasonable conduct of a complainant, particularly unreasonable persistence. My team also looks at the data and the trends that come from our own complaints, and this is something that we have seen in the work we do. On top of that, we also conduct reviews of our own complaints, and we have seen through that an increase in unreasonable persistence. Today we have over 250 participants at today's session, which is excellent. Thank you for everyone for attending. We have people here from Commonwealth and ACT government agencies, private sector organisations that are covered by our industry ombudsman functions, and also some other complaint handling bodies. I would like to pay a particular welcome to our international ombudsman colleagues from Samoa and the Solomon Islands. Welcome. We have complaint handlers, complaint managers, and also people who deal with members of the public through other avenues in today's session. Given it is such a large group, over 250 people, this workshop may work slightly differently to other workshops you have done online. We will have some interactivity, but we won't be doing this through breakout groups. This will mostly be done through polls, which will come up on your screen, and we'll also have a section where we'll ask you to provide your feedback. You can do this through the questions functionality by pressing the hands up icon, which is in blue. In today's presentation, we are going to be talking about the value of complaints and complaint handlers, consistent with the theme of this year's Complaints Handling Forum. We're also going to be talking about the 5 types of unreasonable conduct of a complainant before going into unreasonable persistence in particular. The main part of today's workshop is going to be practical strategies for managing unreasonable persistence. And then I'll get onto some specific responses you can use when you are responding to this type of conduct. Before we get into the main part of today's presentation, I did want to talk on the value of complaints and complaint handlers. I'm preaching to the converted here. Most of you are complaint handlers already. But I just wanted to go through this diagram on the screen and talk about how complaint handlers and complaints are important, but also the impact of unreasonable conduct of a complainant. Firstly, organisations who can use their complaints well will become a more effective organisation and more successful. Complaints give us an insight into what is happening in that organisation. They can be the canary in the coal mine and tell you about issues before they become bigger. And they can also demonstrate what things are working well. You can measure change in the changes in complaints. Moving clockwise around the diagram here, I also wanted to acknowledge that managing complaints is a difficult role. I've done this job myself as well, and it can get quite difficult at times, and it is a demanding role and can be stressful. This is particularly the case when you are managing unreasonable conduct of a complainant. It may be that a single incident is not much of a problem, but over time that can become quite draining. And I wanted to say that straight away. The focus on today's presentation is about how you can put some strategies in place to manage that. And main part of that is for your own well-being as well, and the well-being of your staff. Moving to the next quadrant, another part of this is having self-care strategies in place yourself. Looking at some of the things you can do to manage the stress that comes from managing complaints. These can be the same self-care strategies you might use in other areas of your life. Making time for exercise, spending time with your friends, diet, and also making sure you get enough sleep. Some of the more the strategies that are more relevant to your organisation and your work may be about taking time to debrief after a difficult phone call, going for a walk, and supporting your colleagues. The final quadrant here is about organisations providing the support, the empowerment, and the training for staff to take these self-care strategies and also to manage unreasonable conduct of the complainant. Some of these strategies we'll talk about during this workshop today, but one of the big ones I wanted to talk about was having a culture where people do value complaints and also that the well-being of complaint handlers is put as a top priority. I'd now like to go to the definition of unreasonable conduct of a complainant. This has come from the New South Wales Ombudsman's Manual for Managing Unreasonable Conduct of a Complainant, the most recent version of which was published at the end of last year. The definition here is any behaviour by a person which, because of its nature or frequency, raises substantial health, safety, resource or equity issues for the people involved in the complaint process. There's a few things I wanted to draw out of this definition here and discuss. One is that the impacts that can happen from unreasonable conduct of a complainant can be quite broad, as shown in that definition. Also, the people that can be affected can be quite broad as well, and we'll come to that a little bit later in the workshop. There's also been a subtle change in the terminology used here as well. Some of you may remember that previously we talked about unreasonable complainant conduct. This is now changed to unreasonable conduct of a complainant. I quite like this subtle change. It changes the focus from the person being unreasonable to the conduct they're displaying being unreasonable. This is consistent with the advice that we provide as well. Our advice is that you should handle the issues that are raised in the complaint separately from the conduct of what the person is telling you, is saying. Managing these two things separately means you can avoid bias. An example I'll give you is you can have someone who's lovely to talk to, they're a joy to talk to on the phone, but the issues of their complaint have no substance and there's nothing to really look at there. On the other hand, you may have a complainant who's shouting and screaming and swearing at you, but their complaint has a lot of substance. It may show something that's systemic and that needs to be handled. So it is useful to separate out those two areas of your work. The other thing I wanted to touch on with this definition here as well, and the new terminology that's used, is that we recommend that people focus on the observable conduct and what people have said or written in their correspondence with you, instead of working out why they are demonstrating that conduct. There is a correlation there between mental health and some of these types of conduct. That's not always the case. And there's a real risk there if we prescribe it always as being something to do with mental health. Most of us are not employed as psychologists or psychiatrists, so it's much better to look at the specific types of conduct and put strategies in place to manage those, instead of trying to fix the person or change why they may be doing these things. There are 5 types of unreasonable conduct by a complainant, which are have set out by the New South Wales Ombudsman in their manual on managing unreasonable conduct of a complainant. Today's workshop focuses on unreasonable persistence. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We also have unreasonable behaviours. Now, these are the most commonly talked about type of unreasonable conduct. However, fortunately, they're probably not the most common either. This is people who are acting aggressively. They're shouting and swearing, threatening harm to themselves and others. If they're physically present as well, they may be quite intimidating in their physical actions. These get a lot of attention because a single incident of unreasonable behaviours can have a real impact on the staff involved and their well-being. It often means as well that they are escalated to senior managers, so they have more oversight of these matters. But as I said, fortunately, they're not the most common type of unreasonable conduct of a complainant. Unreasonable arguments are another type that are more common, and on their own, they may not be much of a problem, but they can become over a long time. There's a build-up effect there. Some of these unreasonable arguments are, and you would have had these in your line of work, when you're talking to a complainant, you provide information that you have received through your investigation, and you talk to a complainant about that, and they say that it's fraudulent, it's forged, and we shouldn't believe it, or that we've missed the main issues of the complaint. They also may, at the more extreme end, be moving into conspiracy theories, and also they may be changing the goalposts as they go through your complaint. You get to the end, you've looked at what you thought they wanted you to look at, and they change their mind and want you to look at something else. Unreasonable demands are another common type. Often these happen early in a complaint once you receive it. You may have a complainant who wants you to look at their complaint as a priority, ahead of everyone else. It needs to be handled straight away or there'll be serious consequences. They probably don't want you to handle it either. They want your manager, the head of your agency, someone more senior to look at their complaint because it is so important. They may also then make demands around the outcomes, what you can achieve, and these may not be in line with what your organisation can actually do. The final type is an unreasonable lack of cooperation. Often this can come across as complainants being disorganised. So at the start of a complaint, they may, in dribs and drabs, send you information or send you a whole lot of information in one go without taking the time to explain why that information is important for their complaint. They may also not respond when you ask them for information either, which can be quite problematic. So there are 5 types of unreasonable conduct by a complainant. We're now going to move on to unreasonable persistence. I have 2 very broad examples here of unreasonable persistence. I think you can break it up into two groups depending on when this conduct happens in a complaint process. The first one is while you are handling that complaint. And this often comes through an unreasonable amount of correspondence. You'll have all experienced this. It's a person who called you 5 times a day about the same matter, despite you saying you'll call them back in 2 weeks. It's coming into work on a Tuesday morning, and you can see that the complainant has sent you 4 emails the night before between the hours of 1 and 4 a.m. with 10 attachments each that they demand that you read straight away. That can have an impact on how you handle that particular complaint. The other type of unreasonable persistence is a person that comes back multiple times about the same issue. This will often involve multiple staff members, members of your team, or members of your organisation. It can also happen over a longer period of time. You might have someone who made a complaint and they don't come back for 3 or 4 years, but they're complaining about the same issue, despite it being investigated through to the relevant law and to finality. They won't let go, they'll keep coming back. We now have our first poll here. This is your first chance to interact with us. And I have a pretty simple question here I'd like you to answer using the functionality on your screen. Have you experienced unreasonable persistence during your career? Yes or no? We'll give everyone a few moments to do this before we close the poll. This may be in a complaint handling role, in your current role, but also if you haven't experienced in a complaint role, has it happened in some other type of role? Perhaps you worked in a retail role previously. So we'll close the poll now. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Adam Claxton here, who is with me today, and he's going to read through the results that have come through.
Okay, for poll question 1, we have you experienced unreasonable persistence during your career? We have 97.8% of people saying yes. 2.2% said no.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam. That's what we expected, I think, there. But that's interesting to hear as well. I'm sure some of the people that are with us today, they may not be in frontline complaint handling roles. And if you are one of those 2.2% of people who haven't experienced it, I'm very happy for you. I hope that continues as well. We have our second poll today. There are a few more options here. If you have experienced unreasonable persistence, so those 97.8% of people, can you please tell us, when was the last time you experienced it? Was it today? That's some serious commitment if it was today, if you're taking complaints this morning. Was it during the last week, the last month, the last year, or was it more than a year ago? We'll give everyone a few moments there as well. Approximates are fine. If you can't quite remember, we're trying to get an indication here.
All right.
Okay, we'll now close the poll. And Adam.
So the majority say that in the last month, they've experienced unreasonable persistence. That is at 29.5%. Sorry, it's changed. The majority was actually in the last week, so that was 31.5%. 8.9% more than a year ago.
Do we have anyone today?
We have 8 people said they experienced it today.
Wow. That's real commitment. I really commend those people for taking calls. I'm sorry you had to put up with that today. I hope some of the strategies are going to help you with dealing with that type of conduct. That's interesting to hear. I think with those stats that we looked at there, this is reasonably common. It's part of the, maybe not every day of handling complaints, but in the last week or last month, most people have had to deal with unreasonable persistence. We're now going to move on to another interactive task here, and we're going to use this example throughout today's workshop. What I want people to do is to think about a time when they experience unreasonable persistence. So that's 97.8% of people. I want you to take some of your own notes here about what that example was, but using the question functionality. This is the hand up icon there that is on your screen. I'd like you to send through 1 or 2 characteristics of that type of conduct. How was that person displaying unreasonable persistence? What were they doing? So I'd like you to take some quick notes for yourself about that scenario, because we will come back to this, but send us through the question functionality a few examples of those characteristics. It doesn't necessarily need to be a really particularly serious example as well, one that had a great impact on you. It could be something that happened today for those 8 people who have had to deal with something like this today. We're interested to see the breadth of experiences that you've had. So we'll wait for some of those questions to come through. As they come through, we'll have a think about some that I've seen as well, just to share some examples there. Some of the examples that I have seen when handling these is the incessant communication. I mentioned it already. They're examples that I've put up with where had to deal with, where you're getting a lot of emails overnight. And that seems to be quite a common one coming through quite late in the evening, getting those questions, those emails coming through, lots of information. Adam, do we have any responses that have come through?
So far, we don't have any that have come through, but I can think of some myself.
Great. Adam, thank you.
I do complaint handling myself, and just that insistent flood of emails. I had someone say that they're going to go to the media unless I gave them the outcome they were seeking.
Yep.
Okay. I have a submission where they didn't listen to reason. They wanted the matter to be dealt with at the highest level. Raising their voice, making unreasonable demands, persistent emails and phone calls. So that's what we're talking about. Resending the same correspondence repeatedly.
Okay.
And to lots of different people.
Yep. So different people in the organisation, often they'll CC in people from other organisations as well. We often see that.
Hanging up on me when they don't like the answer given. And threatening to email daily until a decision is made. Threatening self-harm, apportioning blame for it to our decision.
Okay.
Copying in multiple people in companies. So a few people saying that.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks everyone for those responses. That's really interesting to see some of the different ways that people are displaying unreasonable persistence. We also had in there some other types of unreasonable conduct of a complainant as well. And it's often difficult to separate out the different types of conduct into their categories. They're not necessarily neat or mutually exclusive. Often someone can have unreasonable arguments and they can be demanding and they can be persistent. So I made a list before this presentation of some of the things that I've seen to run through with you guys today. Excessive correspondence or phone calls are probably the most common one and the easiest to note in some ways. One you may have seen as well, I'm sure most of you are shaking your head, is where you have written materials that have been annotated with notes and sent through to you. Post-it notes all over them, highlighters. Speaking over officers during calls, we had someone who mentioned that, shouting over them and hanging up on phone calls as well. Rhetorical questions is an interesting one. This is often can come across as an attempt to wedge you on an issue. So how can your colleagues be so stupid, so corrupt? Asking questions where they're really not looking for an answer and you shouldn't even really be responding to those. Threats and blame, and I want to separate these out from the types of threats that are physical harm to you or even harm, but it might be threats like Adam talked about, that I'm going to go to the media, I'm going to escalate this matter further. They may also blame you for what's happening in their life and the decisions that have been made by, for example, your agency or your company in what's happening to them. They might blame you for example, their living situation, whether they have been able to complete their studies or whether they've been able to get a job. They'll put it down to you as a complaint handler. And refusing to accept a decision is a really common form of unreasonable persistence. I want everyone to go back to the example that they were thinking of. This time, this is a self-reflection. We don't need you to send through your responses this time. I'd like you just to think and to write down, if you'd like, what impact did that unreasonable persistence have on you? And I mentioned earlier, it may not be that there was much of an issue with that particular incident, that one-off time that someone sent you multiple emails in one night, but there can be a build-up effect over a long time. So just for the next 30 seconds or so, have a think about what the impacts were on you, and then I'll talk about some of the impacts that we have seen through this type of conduct. The impacts that I put up here, these link back to the definition of unreasonable conduct of a complainant that I mentioned earlier in today's workshop. I'm talking specifically about unreasonable persistence here, but they do cross over as well. What I've done is I've gone to that definition where it said the people involved in the complaints handling process, and I've summarised them here to discuss with you today. I've also included financial resources at the end there. So the impact that's probably most noticeable is on staff. And as we talked about, these can over a period of time start to get you down if you're dealing with these every day, or as most people said, between every week and every month. If you're dealing with those each day, it can have an impact on your motivation as well. If it's not managed well at the more extreme end, you can then have impacts on whether someone wants to stay working with your organisation. So retention becomes a problem. And at the most extreme end, you can then even have issues with recruitment. A lot of recruitment in complaints handling roles goes on reputation and word of mouth. If unreasonable persistence is not managed well, people may simply not apply for jobs with an organisation. The complainant, the person who is actually displaying unreasonable persistence, can also be someone who's impacted by their own conduct, which might sound a little bit strange. But this is particularly if it's not managed well. If a complainant is demonstrating unreasonable persistence by coming back about the same issue over a period of time, or if they're trying different channels. So often they'll try coming through different phone lines to your organisation, maybe your complaints lines, your inquiries lines, and a program-specific line. If they're doing that, they may be dealing with different staff members. They may get slightly different information, which can be confusing, and it might lead to a negative outcome for that person. Also, while I mentioned our role is not to try fix why the person is demonstrating this type of conduct, if we don't manage unreasonable persistence well, it can reinforce that type of behaviour. That may have an impact on that person when they try to deal with other areas of your organisation or other organisations in their life more generally, if they think it's okay to be unreasonably persistent and if it hasn't been called out at some stage. Probably the most obvious impact here is on other complainants. Through this unreasonable persistence, it's taking up a lot of your time as a complaint handler. You simply don't have as much time to deal with these other complainants. Might also be that your motivation starts to wane over the course of a day or week when you've been dealing with this, and so they don't get as positive an interaction. We are all human. While we all strive to provide the best service, unreasonable persistence can draw us down if we're not managing it well. Senior executives of organisations are incredibly busy people. A characteristic of unreasonable persistence is that people will try to get as high up the organisation as they can. And that can often mean that people in very senior positions, including the head of an agency or an organisation, are then dealing with complaints that really don't have a lot of substance or require them to be involved. They could be using their time to do other things, so that can be an impact there. Finally, all of those impacts there will have an impact on the financial resources of an agency or organisation. If you're a private sector organisation, that can affect your bottom line. If you're a government agency, you have a limited budget. It means you won't be able to do other things that you might have otherwise been able to do, particularly, as I said, handling other complaints. We're now going to go on to the particular strategies, and this is the main part of today's presentation. Strategies to manage unreasonable persistence. All of these strategies, though, I want to stress, should be looked at as general strategies that can be adjusted for your organisation or your agency and its characteristics. This includes the types of complainants or members of the public that you deal with, that cohort. I'm going to talk at some of the examples about how you may want to do something if you're a very small agency that maybe gets a handful of complaints every month or so and doesn't have much of a public-facing role, compared to some organisations where complaint handling is a major part of their role and they're getting thousands of complaints every year. So have a look at these strategies, think about how would it work in your organisation and make some modifications there to make it work. Another one of the limitations that you may have for your organisation or your agency is the legislation you work under, or the policies or the rules. They may limit what you can and cannot do. They may be quite prescriptive in saying that you must contact someone a certain way, so some of these strategies may not be relevant. But with some adjustment, they will work. The first strategy I want to talk about is about managing expectations early. And this is a strategy that can be used upfront for all complainants, not just complainants who have demonstrated unreasonable persistence. In fact, it can be used for potential complainants before they even make a complaint to you. Managing expectations can be done through a couple of different ways. You may want to put these expectations up on your website so everyone can see them before making a complaint, through fact sheets, or if you're engaging with people face-to-face or by the phone, you may want to do it that way instead. The expectation should say, when managing expectations, providing the information, you should tell people what you, in your role, and also your organisation or agency, can and cannot do. What is the scope of your role? What is your jurisdiction? What can you achieve for that particular complainant? You should also include what are your expectations of them. What does your organisation or agency define as being reasonable conduct? What are your minimum expectations there? This may be as simple as saying, that you will treat them with respect and you expect them to do so as well, and that you will cooperate and work together to resolve a complaint. It should also outline the steps that are going to happen in your complaint process. What will happen throughout that process, and what are the timeframes that the person can expect? One way of doing this is to present it graphically. So you may want to have a flowchart. Different people will look at information different ways. So if you can have some type of graphic they can look at to see where they are in the process and keep them updated throughout, that can be a really helpful way of doing that. Managing the expectations early also means you're going to have a consistent approach to how the complaints are handled and what people expect. That's why it's important to do this centrally if you can. Your website ideally, fact sheets that are sent out, or if you are relying on one of your staff members saying it to someone, either on the phone or face-to-face, that you do this with standard words or some type of scripting so your staff know what to say. Another strategy is when someone actually makes a complaint is to get them to define what issue they are seeking. If it's something that you cannot do, let them know straight away that's something you can't do. Doing this early in the complaint handling process is going to have a much more positive outcome than doing it at the end of the process. It may mean that you're able to minimise the impact of unreasonable persistence by telling someone you can't do what they want, and that may mean that they don't make a complaint in the first instance, or that they accept what you can and can't do. Second strategy, and this is another general one that goes for all complaints, not just managing unreasonable persistence, is to have standard procedures in place. I'm talking specifically here around procedures of managing unreasonable conduct of a complainant and also unreasonable persistence, but they don't need to be their own standalone procedure. Depending on the size of your organisation, this may be part of a larger complaints handling policy or even interacting with members of the public policy, as long as there's content there on managing unreasonable persistence. What your standard processes should do is they should allow the same or very similar response from different staff members in your organisation to the same type of conduct of unreasonable persistence. That means there's a fairness element here as well, and consistency. And through that, staff should also know what is your organisation's threshold for what is and isn't unreasonable persistence. For some agencies and organisations, it may be quite normal for your staff to talk to a complainant or a member of the public, a customer or client several times a day. That might be a part of the characteristics of your complainant cohort and the work you do. So that is not necessarily unreasonable persistence. You might set your threshold slightly higher. If you're a policy agency or an organisation that has limited involvement with the public, a second follow-up phone call on the same day about an issue where you've already spoken to someone may be your threshold for unreasonable persistence. You might want to call it there and say, this is when our policies come into place. Make it proportionate and make it relevant to your organisation. Your standard procedures as well should tell staff what steps they should take once they've identified unreasonable persistence. I'm going to talk about some of those today, but having them set out here is a really good way for staff to feel empowered, to know what they can and cannot do, and also to know that their organisation or agency has their back if they take these actions. It should also, with those actions, say what actions can be taken at different levels. There'll be some strategies and actions that you want to use that you'll only want more senior members of your organisation or agency to take because of the level of seriousness. The policy or procedure should set that out clearly. Procedures are great, but only if they are accessible to staff and if staff know about them as well. They should be easy to read, easy to find, and part of any induction process. When someone starts with you, they should be told about those processes. They should be told they need to read them as well. And as well as that, they should be reminded about the processes and procedures. You may have a more lengthy procedure that people can read in between complaints, but you may also want to have a quick reference guide with some quick tips there about what to do when managing unreasonable conduct of a complainant or particularly unreasonable persistence. We now have another poll here. So for this one, I'm interested in whether you know if your agency or organisation has a policy or procedure for managing unreasonable conduct of a complainant or unreasonable persistence. And what I'm just to make clear here as well, I'm not asking here whether you have a specific policy for that or procedure, but do you know if that is documented somewhere in the broader suite of policies and procedures that your organisation or agency has? Also, I don't expect you to go looking through your intranet now trying to find it. I want to know what you knew about this before this question was asked. So responses we're looking at here are yes, no, or not sure. And if you answer not sure, that actually gives us a fair bit of information that's interesting for us to know. And it may demonstrate that there's some work your organisation could do to promote the policies if they have them, or that they may need to develop them. Okay, so I'll give you on just a little bit longer before I hand over to my colleague, Adam. Okay, we'll close the poll now. Adam, what results did we get?
Okay, so people that do know where their policy or procedures are, we have 47.9% of people saying yes, 25.8% say no, and 26.4% say not sure.
Okay, great. Thanks, Adam. I'm not particularly surprised at that. I think as an exercise out of this, this particular question here is some homework. After this session, go and see if you can find a policy or procedure that refers to unreasonable conduct of a complainant. If you don't have one, you're not able to find one, maybe talk to one of your complaints managers about whether this is something that they can do as well to put this in place. And if you do find one, but it's hard to find, have a chat to them about whether this is something that can be promoted and shared with your colleagues. The next strategy is about identifying and responding to the persistent conduct, that unreasonable persistence. A simpler, more blunt way of putting this out is to call out the unreasonable persistence when you identify it. Now, that's important that we have the procedure in place which sets your threshold for your organisation. And it may not be as explicit as if someone calls more than 5 times in a day, we're going to activate unreasonable persistence. There needs to be some degree of discretion there as well. But staff should know, when do I need to start taking this into account and start looking at strategies? Identifying unreasonable persistence when it is one person interacting with you in a short period of time can be quite easy. The 5 phone calls in a day, the 4 emails overnight, that's pretty clear you've got unreasonable persistence. It can be more difficult though if you have a complainant who's talking to different areas of your organisation. They've called your inquiries line, they've called the program specific area and your complaint lines in the same day. I'll talk a little bit later about strategies, how you can identify that. Also, it may be difficult to find out when someone has made multiple complaints about the same issue over a longer period of time. Again, the next strategy will cover off on that. Once you have identified that unreasonable persistence, it's important that you raise that with the complainant. Talk about the impact that might have and ask them to stop, but put in place some strategies for how they can interact with you instead of what they have been doing. Towards the end of today's workshop, I'll go through some more specific responses and strategies for doing that. But it is important, once it is identified early, that you do address that and call it out. And in many cases, that will stop or at least minimise that unreasonable persistence. Leaving it until it becomes a much larger issue is not going to help anyone involved. The next strategy here is more of a complaints-wide and an organisation-wide system strategy here. It's about having a good record system. This can be a complaints management system, but this is one where I think it's really important to be proportionate based on the size of your organisation, how many complaints you get, and also the degree of interaction you have with members of the public. If you're a small organisation that gets a handful of complaints every week or month, and you have 1 or 2 people working on complaints as part of their other roles, it may be fine just to have a shared inbox and then an Excel spreadsheet kept in a shared folder. That may be all you need for a system. You don't need much more than that. However, if you're a larger organisation that has many staff working on complaints, possibly across different locations, and if you're getting thousands of complaints, you probably want to have a system that's much more sophisticated. You may want to have a standalone IT product that allows you to do some reporting and put additional functionality in. Once again, proportionate and appropriate for your organisation. A record system is only good as the information that's put into it as well. So any information that's added about correspondence you've had with a complainant, be it written, be it by phone or in person, should be entered as soon as possible after it happens, particularly if it does demonstrate unreasonable persistence or unreasonable conduct of a complainant. You need those notes to be contemporaneous and accurate. If you leave your notes till the end of the week to put in, there can be some problems there. What happened on Monday, you're probably not remembering exactly what happened and you might miss out some of the information. And then also, if someone comes back and calls other areas of your organisation on a Wednesday and you haven't put your notes in yet, it's not helping anyone. The system should be centrally located and accessible to anyone who deals with members of the public. As I said earlier, if you're a small organisation and you may only have 2 people who interact with members of the public, a shared folder is probably fine, and you can talk to each other to share information there. However, if you're a larger organisation, it should be accessible to people not just handling complaints, but also people who may be looking at FOI requests or inquiries. Having a common system there can really help with managing unreasonable persistence. Good complaints records tell a story of what's happened previously, and they can also help to reduce duplication of work. If you don't have a good system, what can happen is someone can come back with the same complaint that's been dealt with previously, and a new officer or staff member can then spend a significant amount of time looking over the same issues again, wasting valuable time. So your system should tell you what issues have been raised previously, what type of contact has been made with your organisation, what has been done and what advice has been provided to those complainants. This is particularly important because if you can see that a colleague, or even if it was you a little bit a few years ago, had provided a particular piece of advice, you can ask that complainant straight up, have you done what we said we advised you should do? If they haven't, you can stop what you're doing there, ask them to do that before they return. It also can tell you what can and cannot be done for that person based on what's been done previously, minimising duplication of work. For more sophisticated systems, you may look at having alerts that go on a person's record. If you have a less sophisticated system, this can just be by conversation and email. But something that the Office of the Commonwealth Ombudsman does is we have alerts that go on certain people's records in our complaints management system. We use these rarely and only when we need to. They can be used positively. For some people who have particular communication needs, we'll put an alert there, which means that whenever anyone opens a complaint about a person or that person's record, there's a pop-up on the screen that provides some useful information. One of these that I had today was that someone prefers to have their decision letters sent to them by post, whereas if it's asking simple questions, they can do that by email. That's quite a niche request, but it's useful to be able to put that in the pop-up and make sure that we are abiding by the communication requests of that complainant. We also use these alerts for how we manage unreasonable persistence as well. We keep them very factual, and we assume that they could be looked at by the complainant if they requested that information as well. So in that alert, we'll talk about how many complaints that person has made in the past in a time frame about a particular issue, a quick summary of the issue, and what steps officers should do if that complainant comes back with the same issue again. That may be referring to a particular staff member, or it might be saying that we will only need to file records here and not do anything further. That saves, though, our officers from having to go look through other complaint records, and they can then deal with that while they're on the phone with those particular complainants. Once again, they may not be relevant for all of your organisations, but you can use similar strategies, even if it is just talking with your colleagues. The next one is about what to do once you've made a decision. Be firm in your position and say no. What we mean here is, as I spoke about earlier, it's important that you avoid bias when you're dealing with someone who's demonstrating unreasonable conduct of a complainant or unreasonable persistence. That you still look at their complaint and you handle it in line with your policies and procedures. You look at it thoroughly and appropriately and proportionally. And when you come to a decision, you go through the normal procedural fairness steps. What we're saying here is once you've done that though, you can then say no when a complainant is unreasonably persistent. Just because they keep coming back saying that they're unhappy with the outcome, they want you to do more, if you have followed your processes and policies and made a decision, stick by it. If you keep coming back and letting them provide more information and slightly changing the way you're doing your complaint, that is not going to help anyone involved. It is much better to stick with that original decision, do it right the first time. Another strategy here is your organisation or agency may have appeal or review rights in place. If this is the case, make your decision, and if the complainant demonstrates that they're unhappy with what you've done, send them to those appeal or review rights and let them follow the process all the way through. Don't be worried about changing your original decision based on what they say. It's better to let the process run its course. One of those review rights and one of those steps may be escalation to our office. It may be through the Commonwealth or ACT Ombudsman functions, maybe through our industry Ombudsman functions. If you have someone who's unreasonably persistent, tell them about all their options, encourage them to take those steps. Another strategy you can do here, and this should only be used rarely, is to take a holistic approach. We've been doing this particularly since the start of the pandemic. We've been looking more at complainants who have come back to us many times about similar issues, but not necessarily the same issues. I should say that when we are defining unreasonable persistence here, it can involve people who come back with the same issue over and over after it's been handled. But it doesn't necessarily go all the way to someone who's making many complaints about different issues. That could be an unreasonable lack of cooperation, but there may be good reasons there for them to do so. And it's important that we don't cut off people's rights to make future complaints. What we've observed, and using our data, looking into it and spending a bit more time looking at trends of people who have made multiple complaints, is to take a holistic approach and look at all of our past complaints that person has raised and bring it together as a whole. Look at all the issues to see, are there matters that we've missed? Should we have asked some more questions here? But then more importantly, and to manage the risk of further unreasonable persistence, we also then think about what other issues should we look at and what other issues could be raised. We then in some cases will conduct an almost own motion investigation, but we'll involve the complainant, letting them know that we have started that investigation. To use this strategy, it's important that you talk to the complainant. You may have to spend several hours with them, but tell them that you are conducting a thorough review and a holistic assessment, and you want them to think about any issues that could be related to that particular topic, be it engagement with your agency or your organisation. By doing this, it can give you assurance that everything has been done well. It can address any issues that have emerged. But the real way of managing unreasonable persistence through this strategy is that you can stop future complaints from coming by handling them beforehand, being proactive instead of reactive. This does take a lot of resources, so it will need to be weighed up on whether there is a benefit of doing this outweighs the benefit of having individual complaints coming through on an ongoing basis. What we found, and one of the reasons why this was important, is these complainants were often raising individual complaints, but then they were seeking a review for each of those complaints as well. So it wasn't just a time of investigating or assessing their original complaint, but also the review aspects as well. Doing it as a single complaint reduced that workload, led to a better outcome. And what we always do as well is to provide a summarised decision letter which talks about all the issues they have raised, the decisions we've made, the information they need. Then they're offered one final review right, and it becomes easier for our officers as well. If that person raises a future complaint, the officers can go back to that single decision letter, which will tell you all the issues that have been raised about. One of our examples we have is a complaint that was first raised in 1989 and through to now, all the issues that have been involved. The last strategy is to be used fairly sparingly, and this last strategy here about considering service limitations or restrictions should be used even more sparingly. This is really for those people who just will not stop persisting and will keep coming back despite using the other strategies. Before you consider these restrictions, it's important that you call out the behaviour early, as I talked about at strategy number 3. You raise this with the complainant, you give them an opportunity to change their conduct, reduce the amount of contact they're having with you, or to accept a decision once you've made it. But if they're not following through with that, and particularly if it's having an impact on your staff, your colleagues, your organisation, you may need to put some of these strategies in place. I'll go through some of the examples, but it's important as well that, as I said, you give them an opportunity to stop their behaviour first, but also that these are time-limited strategies and limitations you put in place. You're not putting them in place and setting and forget. Once they are put in place, you also tell the complainant why they're in place, how long they'll be in place, and also what they can do to have those restrictions lifted in the future. What type of conduct do they need to stop doing, and that you're willing and open to doing that. You should look to recover that relationship you have and the engagement if the conduct stops. While also balancing, you need to look after the well-being of your staff as well. Restrictions, again, will depend on your complainant cohort and also your organisation and how you deal with members of the public. It may, for example, be that for some people you need to stop all phone calls for a particular period of time because of the volume of phone calls that are coming through, or even the content of what the person is saying. It may be that you have emails go to a single account or a single person rather than that person being able to send them across your whole agency, as someone raised earlier as an example of unreasonable persistence. For phone calls, you might instead have it that someone can call between a particular period of time, say 2 hours a week, or you may have a regular appointment where one of your staff calls that person outbound every fortnight to provide an update. These are just some of the strategies you can use. If you have face-to-face interaction, you'll need to have other strategies as well. One of the things to consider here is about the individual complainant. This needs to be done on a case-by-case basis. So what are the particular communication needs of that person? If that person is illiterate and doesn't own a mobile phone or computer, saying they can only communicate by email is obviously not going to work. You need to be flexible here and think about what strategies you can put in place. In those types of circumstances, you may want to have someone act on behalf of that particular complainant. And this could be someone from a consumer action law centre, an advocacy group, a family member, a friend or a neighbour to act on their behalf. As I said, it's about being proportionate, but also about being flexible. So they're the different strategies at a broad level that we recommend when managing unreasonable persistence. I'm now going to talk about some of the specific strategies and responses you can do provide in response to unreasonable persistence. So when you have persistent phone calls or emails, which are the most common ones, I said before you may want to call these out. What we've found quite effective is you can actually give the complainant a choice. You can say to them, I can see that you've called me, this is the 5th time you've called me today, or this is the 4th email you've sent me. I'm unable to assess your complaint while you still send me these correspondence. I'm willing to wait 2 weeks for you to send any information you need to me, and then I'll handle your complaint. Or, if you'd prefer, we can agree for you to stop sending information and I'll handle the information you have now and assess that before getting back to you. You're putting the power in their hands. You're giving them the choice of what to do without having to keep changing your assessment process based on that unreasonable persistence. If a complainant is unhappy with the decision you made, then as I said earlier, put them through the review process. Don't try to go back on your original decision and second guess it. Make your decision, stay firm. Tell them everything about what that review process will involve. Help them to make that decision, but don't be worried about putting them to that next stage. Let the process run its course. It's unlikely with people who are displaying a lot of unreasonable persistence that you are going to be able to change their minds. You may just need to go to that last step to get the degree of finality. Then if you have someone, this is a third response here, who is not accepting a decision even after a review, you may need to explain that no further steps will be taken. Something we do in my team around reviews is we will say that we only review a matter once and we will not conduct a review of a review. We also, in some cases, will say any further correspondence about this issue, now that the review is completed, will be filed and assessed, but we may not respond. This can save your organisation a lot of time while not cutting off an avenue there for that particular complainant. It can mean that they can raise issues that they may think need to be looked at previously. You will assess that, and it could be quite a simple assessment, but you don't need to respond to and counter any arguments that person's made. But they are there on your file to look at later if necessary. In many cases, the assessment will be as simple as the original decision maker looking at it, recognising that it's the same information has been provided previously, and adding a very simple note why no further action needs to be taken. The backdoor approach or forum shopping, the fourth response here, this is where someone tries to come through different channels. They might put an online form in, send an email, they'll write a letter to the head of your agency or organisation and try the different phone lines I talked about earlier. This is where it's really important to have a good records management system, or at the very least talk to your colleagues. When you identify this happening, call it out. You can do this in a nice way. You can say to the complainant, I can see that you have spoken to my colleagues in other areas. I'm the right person to talk to about your complaint. Please send any correspondence to me. My colleagues will do the same thing as well. That just tells the complainant that you're aware of what they've tried there, but you give them the information they need and who they need to talk to as well. If someone is submitting follow-up complaints, so this is where you've made a decision and they've raised the same issues again, once again, call it out, but do it in a nice way. You can say to them, I can see that we have finalised a complaint about these same issues 6 months ago, and we provided this advice. You can even attach a copy of that original decision letter if it's something that they may have lost over time or forgotten about. But you don't have to go back and look at that issue again. Once again, you can say, we have looked at this complaint, we've reviewed it, we only review it once. The final response here is when someone tells you that you've failed them. And this is often, once you've told them you're not going to look at it any further, it gets to the blame stage. Don't engage with this. Go back to what your role is. Say that if it's relevant, that you're impartial, that you're not an advocate, that you've made a decision, you've followed your processes and your decision as final. And then if they continue to blame them, you may need to look at whether that correspondence is simply filed and you don't take further action there as well. So there's a whole range of strategies there. As I said, they are general enough that they should work across all the different members of the audience who are here today, working for small private sector organisations, large government agencies, in organisations which receive many thousands of complaints every year to those who receive a handful every week. We're going to go back to our final exercise here of your thought experiment that we started with at the start of today's workshop. Once again, this is just for you to consider and self-reflect. You don't need to send us any responses for this. What I'd like you to do is to think about that time where you experience unreasonable persistence, and based on the strategies I've discussed today, what would you do differently? Take this away with you. Maybe you can do this after today's workshop and think about whether you can change those and what you would do in future. Because as we saw from some of those stats that came through from the poll, in the next week to a month, you're likely to experience unreasonable persistence again. So in summary for today's workshop, unreasonable persistence, as we saw once again from those poll results, is a common feature of complaint handling. It can have an impact, quite a serious impact on staff through a build-up effect as well, and that can impact on the organisation's ability to do its work. If you've handled a complaint well and thoroughly, followed your processes, then you should feel comfortable when someone comes back to you asking for you to change decision to say no and put strategies in place to communicate that well. Finally, it's important that you look after yourself through self-care strategies, and maybe just as importantly, that you look after your colleagues. If your colleague has had a difficult phone call, is struggling with unreasonable persistence, take the time to go out for a coffee or a walk, chat to them, debrief, make sure you look after each other. That's the end of the formal part of today's workshop. I'm now going to invite people to submit any questions they may have. We've got almost half an hour for any questions you have around managing unreasonable persistence, around managing unreasonable conduct of a complainant, and also more broadly, just about handling complaints. There is a resources section on the page you're looking at today that will take you to our website. On our website, we have some insight reports. We just started putting these out fairly recently, and they are quick guides, 4 to 6 pages, which talk about particular topics and provide some guidance for complaint handlers. We have one on unreasonable persistence. We also have one on communicating with members of the public and how to do that well and how to avoid some of the pitfalls of poor communication. We have better practice guides, including a better practice complaint handling guide, which is a really useful resource for all organisations, complaint handlers, managers, and members of senior executive of organisations and agencies. We have a complaint handling guide for managing unreasonable complainant conduct, and also a specific guide for overseas student education providers. My team provides training and webinars, workshops like this to ACT and Commonwealth government agencies. If you're interested, please email us at education@ombudsman.gov.au. And finally, we have a targeted audit program that we run with government agencies, which looks at your complaints handling systems. We may look at specific parts, and we provide recommendations on how to make improvements. This can be done for organisations who have recently implemented a new system or are looking to make changes. We can look at quite specific parts of it or the whole system. Once again, if you're interested, please email us. We'll now move on to the question and answer section. You're probably sick of my voice by now. I'm going to hand over to Adam to ask some of those questions. Please feel free to send them through. You can send us some curly ones as well. As I said, can be about this particular topic of managing unreasonable persistence, can be about broader unreasonable conduct of a complainant, or about handling complaints.
All right.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Tim. Question 1. How does the Ombudsman handle complaints about agencies restricting people's access to their services?
So I think this is about looking at how would we handle, if someone came to us and they were concerned about an agency restricting their access, possibly because of unreasonable persistence. Like most of our complaints, we will look to see, have you followed your own policies and procedures? So we'd ask for copies of those. We'd look to see, had the complainant been told about what was going to happen, given opportunity to change? And really, have they put in place opportunities and strategies there to try recover that relationship as well? Really, it's about, have they followed their processes and procedures, and were they fair processes and procedures put in place?
And I just have a follow-up on that question. What do you recommend as a time frame for restricting services?
This is a little bit of a cop-out answer here. It's really going to depend, once again, on the case-by-case circumstances, the organisation involved, the degree of interaction there. Sometimes we've seen 3 months as a period there as well. In some cases, you may need to put something short and sharp in place. So if you have a new complainant who's come through and has made several dozen phone calls in the first day that they've contacted you, you might want to put something in place quickly, but only for a week to start with. Really depends on those circumstances. Having a review process throughout as well, so it's not a set and forget. So 6 weeks to 3 months is probably appropriate in some cases. In other cases, you may want to make it as short as a week or a few days.
Thanks, Tim. Moving on to the next question. So, it is not uncommon for individuals to exhibit unreasonable behaviour across multiple government organisations. Not only does this impact staff and drain resources, but it can be very costly for government as they are often vexatious and highly litigious. Do you think we should be working towards a broader public service approach to deal with unreasonable conduct rather than at an agency level?
That's an interesting question. I'm going to draw out part of that around the vexatious nature. This is something that I didn't talk about in the presentation, but I was expecting would come up as a question somewhere. When we're talking about a complaint being vexatious, often depending on your organisation, that can be, you have powers there that you can choose not to look at a complaint because of its vexatious nature. We rarely do that at the Commonwealth Ombudsman, often because with some of these strategies, you can look into a matter in a proportionate way, assess the complaint, and decide to not take any further action based on what's there. You can then go through that review process, as I talked about, and you can say that we only look at a matter once, and you can look at the matter but stop, close it off there. To the question, the broader question about should we be looking at this as a broader public service, it is an area that we have seen come up in our correspondence with other agencies as well. So this could be an area that we look to do more work in. The Commonwealth Ombudsman, and also as the ACT Ombudsman and Industry Ombudsman, part of putting on this complaints handling forum over these last couple of weeks and this workshop is to look to provide some of that advice. We are looking at some of the ways that we can provide resources to help with that. But I think, look, there is value in this being an area that could be looked at more broadly. How do we go about that? Within your own organisation, maybe that's something you can talk to your senior leaders about, how we can look at that more broadly. But by having, I think one of the ways we can manage the impact of unreasonable conduct of a complainant is through good training. It is through recruiting staff who have the skills to handle this. It is by agencies having good policies in place and empowering their staff to take steps and being proactive in doing so. I think if you're passive, that's where you can really have some of these impacts.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks.
All right, next question. Do you mind sharing complaints management system that is used by the Ombudsman's office? Is there a further appeal channel if a complainant does not agree with the Ombudsman's decision? Why don't we start with the first question?
Sure.
Complaints management system that we use.
Sure, I'm happy to share that. We use a complaint system called Resolve. There are many other complaints handling systems out there, IT systems that do the same role as well. Have a look at what works for your organisation. I'm not advocating for one system over another, but yes, we use Resolve. I've used that in other complaints handling bodies as well and use different systems. It's really about thinking what are the needs of your organisation and also making sure that you look at the processes you have and having a really considered decision in what system you should use.
Yeah. And the other part of that question, is there another step after the Ombudsman?
Yep. We are the final port of call for a lot of decisions when someone does come to us. So that often means that my team, as the team that looks after reviews, someone may have been through a government agency, made complaints through through often a two-step appeal process or review process at that agency, then goes to one of our complaints handling teams that Adam's part of, and then to my team. We are often that final port of call. There is, under some legislative provisions, they can go to the federal court about our decisions, but that's very costly. So there is no oversight agency of the work that we do. However, we do also have our own quality assurance processes on the decisions that we make as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, next question. Part of policy is to tell complainants we will end the call. Any suggestions how to give my team confidence in doing this? They will say, I'm going to end the call, but then don't have the confidence to do so.
And this is, I think, if you're warning a complainant that you're going to take action, if they don't stop doing something, then you actually need to take that action. Because if you've just provided a warning and it's become a hollow warning, that can in some cases reinforce those behaviours. It sounds like this manager has probably done this already, but really it's just about reinforcing with the staff that they are empowered and trusted to do so, and that the manager has their back if this happens. And if that complainant comes back and complains about the service provided, that the manager is going to stick up for them. One way of doing that is to record that. So when it does happen in your complaint system, record that the call was terminated after a warning. Make it really clear there so anyone else coming back to look at it independently can see why that was done as well. If you are talking about needing to terminate a call, and that is a strategy that often is required, particularly with those aggressive behaviours, talking over them, provide that warning, give the opportunity for the complainant to stop, give them the choice. But if they continue to do it, it is important that you follow through on that threat. So not the threat, through the warning that you provided, that you do terminate the call. That's because the impact it has on staff members as well can be quite intense. So I think for the manager, it's really about saying to the staff, I want you to do this. I'm worried about your well-being. I've got your back here. Nothing is going to happen if you do this. You're not going to get any trouble for doing this. We are encouraging you to do this and to use your discretion. And if you've got appropriate training in place, you can be confident they've made the right decision.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, next question. If you, for example, restricted someone's calls and they ignore the restriction, what else can you do? How do you manage that?
This will depend on the system you have in place as well. Some of the more sophisticated phone line systems you have in place may, for example, mean that you can actually stop particular phone numbers. People who work in agencies or organisations where that happens will probably know that complainants will get a friend's phone or call from a payphone that will come through. One of the strategies there, though, and this depends on your system and how easily you can make it known to all staff members what restrictions are in place, is if someone does call up, is that once they identify themselves, you can tell them that there are restrictions in place, you're aware of that, and terminate the call as well. So there can be a technological solution there. It may also need to be just a knowledge sharing process in place as well. Unfortunately, though, one of the strategies you may want to look at there is whether, if that original service restriction in the letter came from a particular level in your organisation, it may be worthwhile to have someone at a more senior level to send them a letter saying that. Or another strategy there is for an experienced complaints officer to contact that complainant and try to see, are there any issues that they need to handle, and to reiterate why they're not able to call. There will be some people, and it is a very small proportion of people, who, no matter what you put in place, will not change. And in those circumstances, it may just need to be you terminate the call when it comes through.
Thanks, Tim. Just waiting for the next question.
Okay. Encourage you to send any questions. As I said, it can be about complaints handling more broadly. It can be about managing unreasonable conduct of a complainant, or unreasonable persistence. I had a few more questions come through.
Okay. So, do you have any tips on complainants who send multiple complaints about different issues and are usually not upheld or trivial? Example, complaints about poor service that is not reflected when you review interactions. It's a drain on resources to investigate constantly, and the member is going to complain every time they have a transaction.
Mm-hmm. That example there, I think, comes back to the strategy I talked about around having a holistic assessment. So that type of system there is, I would look at more broadly the service that they're being provided. Depending on your organisation or agency, it may be worthwhile, rather than looking at each of those small and possibly trivial matters individually, have a look at what has been the services provided over the last 12 months. Give yourself and your decision makers the assurance that things are working well there. And you may not then need to look into each of these individual matters as they pop up. If there's an ongoing relationship there, what you can do is you might want to look at that holistic assessment every 6 months or 12 months, just to check that things still are working as they should. But another strategy, which is, I think, a broader one here, is, do you need to investigate every complaint? Are there other ways that you can do this? I know from a previous agency which was involved in where there was engagement with people and services provided, we had someone who did these types of things, and it would be, if they weren't given the breakfast cereal they liked every day, we had a call to that organisation phone line, and the understanding there was we could call and say, are you aware of this issue? We could check it, and we had that assurance straight away. And often they were on board with if there were improvements they could make, they'd make them. But it can be looking at simpler, less time-intensive ways where you're more proportionate in the way you handle your complaints. Not doing a thorough investigation of everything, it might be a fairly light touch. So I think light touch, or you can do that holistic one, provide yourself assurance, and you can stick with your decision based on that.
Thanks, Tim. All right, next question. What strategies have you seen work best to ensure the team members dealing with unreasonable complainants, or just challenging in general, well-being supported and maintained?
Mm-hmm. As you know, Adam, this is an area that we've been discussing at the Commonwealth Ombudsman as well. This is one of our priorities. I think the strategies in place that should be put in place are that staff are well trained. A lot of this is about confidence, and it comes back to that earlier question about staff not feeling confident to terminate a call. Investment in high quality training and coaching from experienced people in your organisation is one strategy to look at there as well. EAP services, or you may even want to look at particular psychology services where staff can have a debrief either as a group or individually on a regular schedule, is also one way of managing the burnout that can happen from these types of complaints. Depending on the nature of your organisation or agency, you might want to look at rotations of staff between different areas as well. So it might be that they're not always on the phones taking phone calls. They might be able to have a break every so often. But I think one of the simplest, cheapest, easiest ways to do it is to have that culture of support, where if someone does have a difficult phone call, you've got colleagues rushing to help them and support them. The collegiate manner and having the debrief, often it can be helping someone to reduce their stress levels straight afterwards, reassuring them that they did a really good job, that you heard what they were saying and they did a good job. That can help manage the well-being of the staff member to know that they've got their support from their colleagues as well.
Thanks, Tim. Next question. Following on from ending calls, what if a complainant keeps sending emails after you've told them it delays the processing and finalisation of the complaint? That is, more and more submissions. Is natural justice never ending if they keep communicating beyond a reasonable amount? Mm-hmm. Example, 30 plus emails, repeating and changing, submitting submissions.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry for the person who had to deal with that. That sounds like that would be quite difficult to deal with. Going back to the example of giving them the choice, I think what you could say there is if they choose to continue sending information through, you could say, I'm going to start assessing your complaint now, and I'm only going to look at information that was received before this point. I'm not going to consider information after that date. You may want to give them a time frame to clarify the issues that you want them to look at, and you say anything further after that date, because I've started my assessment, I'm not going to be able to change those as well. So I think there is the natural justice and the procedural fairness there, but it's about being reasonable as well in what you can and cannot look at. You may then look at that whole investigation based on the information that was provided, and then you may, if you need to, at the end of your investigation, quickly scan through the other information to see if anything else was raised. It's unlikely that's going to happen. Or another strategy is that you can assess the information that comes through quickly, but not respond to each piece of information and necessarily tick off that point with the complainant.
Thanks, Tim.
No worries.
I think we're nearing the end of our questions. Haven't gotten any come through. So.
Okay, excellent. Okay, thank you everyone for attending today's workshop. Thank you for those questions. There's some good ones in there. As I said, with all these strategies, it is partly going to depend on your organisation, your agency, how you put these in place, what you do based on the interactions that you have. Unfortunately, you will not be able to stop all forms of conduct. Some of it will still happen. It's about minimising and managing the risk that you have to your staff. I hope you've enjoyed this workshop. I hope you enjoyed our first session of the Complaints Handling Forum on Tuesday with Judy Jones. We have 2 more sessions to come. We have one on Tuesday with Teresa Forthrop from Australia Post. We also have a session next Thursday, which is a panel discussion chaired by our Deputy Ombudsman, Penny Mackay, with 4 ACT Commonwealth government agency representatives and representatives from industry bodies. Ticket sales are still available. If you click on the link for further resources, you can go to our website to buy these tickets. Also, before you end today, when you finalise your session, please use the red button with the cross inside to close your window. This will bring up a survey. We've asked that you provide your feedback on the satisfaction survey, particularly around what topics you'd like to see in future complaints handling forums or our education programs that we provide. Today's session was based on feedback from other sessions we've done, so it's really useful for us to hear from that. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, and I hope you have some good strategies that you can use in managing unreasonable persistence.